Today we are talking about love at work, but maybe not quite in the way that you're expecting. Now, we're going to explore whether or not love can be a true component of organizational culture. I'm talking to Helena Clayton, who's been studying love in organizations and why it is that they feel so loveless many times. What is it that exactly blocks that? And what are the conditions that might enable love to be an explicit part of organizational cultures? Listen in to learn more. Welcome to the Leadership Coaching Group's podcast. I'm your host, Liz Howard, an entrepreneur, author, and executive leadership coach. This is where I introduce you to the top experts that discuss the burning topics that leaders at all levels need to know about. My goal is to help you become a leader that you are confident others will want to follow. So, subscribe to the show, listen in weekly, and watch your confidence as a leader grow. Helena, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really happy that we are having this conversation because it is unique. I've been doing the leadership stuff in the podcast for a long time, and sometimes, there's things that you expect to hear people talking about. And you have kind of, I think, a unique and very important message, and that's talking about love in organizations. But before we dive into that, would you mind telling our listeners in just maybe 1 to 2 sentences who it is that you are?
Of course. So I'm Helena Clayton, and I'm based in the UK, and primarily I design and run leadership and organizational development programs, sometimes for big global brands, sometimes for smaller not-for-profits. I work as a coach and facilitator, and recently I've been researching, writing, and speaking about love in organizations.
Oh, yeah. So interesting. So let's just start from square one. When you're talking about this concept of love in organizations, I imagine people might wonder what exactly you mean by that. So can we just start with the definition? So what are you talking about when you mention love?
Well, it's a great question, Liz, because I don't define it. And so 2 things, I'll come on to that in a moment. First, when I started to say to colleagues and people around me that I was going to research love, most people didn't want me to do that. Most people, colleagues of mine, said, "Ooh, you really mean compassion, don't you? Or kindness or empathy." And I was really clear that I wanted to research love. So already we start to see that there is some lack of ease, perhaps, around the word and its use in organizations. But when I did a piece of research in 2018 now, published in 2019, I consciously didn't define love. Instead, I asked my research participants, how do you define it? So I have what other people see as love. I intentionally haven't defined it because the danger with defining it is that it makes it too small to start researching. And I may well come to a definition some point down the line, but I really wanted to keep the field very open as I began.
What did you learn from those that you spoke to and interacted with? How were they defining love?
It was really clear. The first thing people talked about was, I've given it the heading care. We think of kind of buckets or categories. So caring and care was by far and away the biggest sort of category of responses. And that was nurture, generosity, support, compassion, empathy, kindness. So there was a cluster of words around that. That was really strong. But what came a really close second, and to my surprise actually, was listening. So people saw that when we gave somebody our complete attention, when we truly listened and were 100% present, which meant we weren't, also on our phones or doing something else, people saw that as a gesture of love. And that it was loving to put aside everything that was on our minds and give ourselves totally to listen to the other person. I thought was really interesting. The third one that came out was love was also about setting standards and holding people to those standards. So words like accountability came out as a strong part of love. Boundaries, that it was loving to say no or to hold a boundary or to say that isn't okay. So that was another dimension of it. And the fourth one, the main one, was a theme of around acceptance. So really accepting people for all of who they were, and accepting the person, if not the behavior, saying yes to everything that somebody was. So those were the four key areas that came out of the research.
What made you interested in love in organizations? Because it's a fascinating lens to look at it through.
I've been working in organizations for, I don't know, 20, 25 years. And in parallel to that, I've also done quite a lot of personal growth work, personal development work. Quite radical, quite leading edge, immersive, initiation-based personal growth work. And in those workshops and in those communities, which are a long, long way away from the workplace, what I saw time and time again was that if people had struggles or pain or suffering that we carried around in our lives, when that was met with love, then there was healing. Not that it was healed, but healing took place. And I was looking at my work in organizations, and I was seeing there communities that were, and leadership cultures that were sometimes at best maybe described as benign neglect, and sometimes as dramatic as harsh and brutal. And I got curious, how come I was seeing love do such powerful work in this part of my life, but I was seeing organizations that were perhaps sterile or damaging, and certainly could easily be described as loveless. And I started to see, of course, that the same people who would do a personal growth workshop with me would be the same people who would put on a suit and go to work on a Monday. So it's the same people. So yes, I just got curious as to how could one inform the other? How could the personal growth work that I was doing, which was usually based on strong spiritual practices of some sort, how could that maybe find its way into organizations in a way that could create cultures that were much more human, much more whole, that were regenerative cultures, and where people could really flourish. So yeah, that's where my interest came from.
And that's lovely. I had an experience one time when I was doing a leadership seminar, and it was actually kind of a big group of senior leaders, and they were, we're trying to talk about how do we distill some of their values as leaders. And of course, you heard the things that you'd expect: integrity, and and they're good things. They were participating in a very active manner. And one woman did actually stop and said, "I think it all just comes down to love." And it was so quick that others just spoke over her and kind of brushed that aside, and that really stuck with me, because I was like, well, it was so different. I mean, the voice was so different than the others, and the tone, and it was just such a different thing. And I kind of had to stop and think about, like, what, so she's saying love, why is it that you think that organizations do feel it's so taboo? Like, what makes them feel uncomfortable with this concept of love?
Oh, I know, that's the $64 million question. I think there are lots of reasons, like all of which kind of come into play. It's interesting that it was a woman who used the word love, because I think there is something unhelpful for us here, in that love is seen as gendered. Love is seen as women's work, if you like. And because we know we don't have a gender balanced workforce in most places, then I think it's difficult for love to find a place, because it's seen as women's work. And I wrote a blog quite recently on this, actually, and women don't want to pick up love as a kind of and champion it, because many women don't want to pick up the stuff that is automatically assumed to be women's work, because they want to be seen for other things. But also there is some somehow the workplace has become somewhere that is uh, uh, where the personal isn't really permitted. And I was reading a really wonderful book, actually, a new book on ritual by Casper to Kyle. I'll give you the reference. And he was talking about there was a time when the idea of the sacred and the profane were separated, that something was either secular or it was religious. And I think in a similar but different way, we have something about work. Work has become data rational and logical, and it isn't the home of the emotional. Our emotions and our emotional lives are usually not welcome there. Mm. And so we have these cultures that are hugely technically oriented, but not very emotionally oriented. So I think that doesn't help. In the research, somebody said that love required us to be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And being vulnerable meant that we were weak, and weakness doesn't belong in the workplace. So I think we carry around so many assumptions that love just doesn't have a part in our working life. And we are starting to see that challenged now with, COVID, interestingly, has helped a discussion about love in organizational cultures become a bit more less taboo, if you like. So I think things are changing. The Prime Minister of New Zealand openly talks about love. More and more people at senior levels are doing so. But I think it will take a while before it becomes common parlance or an easy, natural thing to talk about in workplaces.
Mm. There's a lot coming up there. So first and foremost, one of the things that I just wonder as I'm listening to you speak is how much expectation and how much of like this script we have in our mind about what success looks like and what you're supposed to do for success. And then you end up in a workplace that gets you on this kind of predefined ladder that you may not even really want to be on, right? It may be attractive to think I can make this salary or work for this firm, but I feel that there's an awful lot of people that are doing things because they think they're supposed to, and they don't even have the passion for the type of work they're doing. And then to, expect them to dial in love, I think that some absolutely can, but I could see how it might be challenging for some people that are doing work that they don't love to think about bringing love into the workplace. Is there a correlation, or am I just kind of in the clouds right now?
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. And also, it's like, how dare we expect people to bring all of themselves to work? It's like, how dare we expect that of them? It's up to each individual to choose how much of themselves they bring to work. And it is totally okay, exactly as you say, for somebody to hold very clear boundaries about what they bring or give or offer to work, particularly if many of their needs are not being met at work. So it's really complex, and I think it's way more complex, as you rightly say, Liz, than saying we must all be loving at work, or we must all develop loving cultures. Yeah, I think it's much more problematic than that. Yeah.
I'm interested to hear a little bit about some of your respondents and where they came from professionally. Interestingly, and maybe somewhat unexpectedly, I've found that, and of course I wasn't having formal conversations based on, love in and of itself, but the times that it has come up for me in my work, it's not uncommon for it to come from people that have been active duty in a branch of the military, and usually those that have seen war. And it's interesting that they really champion this idea of love and care in a way that, I wasn't always exposed to working in like the really big corporate worlds that I kind of professionally grew up in. Did you find any trends of the types of places or the types of industries that your respondents came from when they seemed especially at ease with discussing love?
Oh, I love that question. So, interestingly, my husband's an ex-Royal Marine, although he'll say there's no such thing as an ex-Royal Marine, but he is nevertheless. And one of the things, to my utter amazement, I learnt in getting to know him was that was how much love there was in his work when he was in the Marines, and the way that. So one of the other things that came out of the research I did was love was also about sacrifice, and that doesn't mean martyring yourself or over-sacrificing, but putting your own needs second. And I learned that that was a very, very strong part of the way the Royal Marines work. For example, you first look after your um, um, fellow soldiers, and then they look after you. So that was very strong and really surprising to me. Um, and I didn't find any other themes in terms of who was more likely to talk about love. But what I did discover in further research was this idea of uh, adverse childhood experiences, so what's often called slow trauma. And the research shows that between 40 and 60% of us as adults have experienced some kind of slow trauma as a child. And slow trauma is defined as something very, as everyday, if you like, as divorce or economic hardship or poverty, through to the less mundane experience of alcoholism or violence in your family, through to physical, sexual, emotional abuse. And what we know about slow trauma is that impacts the way we are able to connect with and express and deal with our feelings. So I think there's some really interesting stuff to explore there about, as adults, what is the trauma, slow trauma, that many of us are walking around with that may block our ability to connect with love. So I'm no expert in that field, but it feels like a really interesting thread to pull on.
Mm.
And there's a lovely piece of research that shows that organizational change very often re-triggers these childhood wounds that we carry. So that has that's really got me very curious and makes sense of a lot, I think.
So thinking about a little bit about that, when we're coming back to organizations and coming back to leaders,
Mm.
I think people might be listening to this and feeling like, there's something here. I'm interested in exploring this concept, maybe with my leadership team, maybe with, my organization. How can they go about doing that in a way that they might be able to move forward and get some progress
Yeah,
and bring some of this into
yeah,
the workplace?
yeah. So it's a great question. Where does somebody start? And it's one thing for me to go into an organisation and talk about love. I don't have to live there. It doesn't really matter what people think. In some ways, it does in other ways, of course. But it's harder, I think, for a leader in an organisation. So this might sound a little self-serving, but I think it has a bit of practical um, heft behind it. So the research report that I wrote, um, it's sometimes helpful if you're introducing a topic that you think might be delicate or not go down well or might be a little weird in your organization, is to give people something to read that you are not attached to, that it's not your view. So one thing I often suggest to people is to download my research report and give it to people and say, I came across this the other day. It seems quite interesting. What do you think? So that way, you're giving somebody something objective to look at so that you can start a conversation about love. So you may then have a team meeting and says, "What did you make of that report? What was in there that you liked, that you thought might have some relevance for us? What did you find difficult or tricky? Is there anything that we could explore together in this organisation from that report?" So that's one way in that will get love on the table, um, without exposing somebody too much or making them feel like they're out on a limb too much. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I agree with you, actually. It is helpful to be able to present something to people and kind of let them play with the concept. And, it's such an interesting thing when we think about communication and bringing new ideas. I love what you said earlier, that sometimes organizational change brings up some of those wounds and the pains from the past. That's fascinating. And I do feel that when we bring up the idea of change in the workplace, sometimes it can be very triggering. And so having something very neutral to kind of present and kind of work through together, it came from a third party. I'm not saying I'm right, wrong, or I'm just presenting something interesting. I think that leaves a lot of space for conversation. I think that's really powerful.
I think that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yes, it's a way in, and all we can do, I think, well, we can do a lot more, I suppose, but all we can initially do is start a conversation. Just get it on the table, and people will pick it up and take it where they will after that.
Yeah. So you have a ton of wonderful experience, and then including this work and research around love and organizations. So coming from you, Helena, what would be just one piece of advice that you might offer to a brand new leader?
Yeah, I think it's around, and I'm probably drawing on my coaching work and my leadership development work as well here. And I think it's around, as leaders, it's very easy to assume that we are supposed to know stuff, that we are supposed to know which direction to go in or what the answer is, or and therefore to move into something of a tell mode of leadership. And what I think we find time and time again is when we can come from inquiry, when we can ask more questions, when we can come from that stance, if you like, then there's a lot more that can happen. So I think it's for leaders to adopt a more inquiring, questioning, curious approach to their leadership practice.
If people want to get in touch with you or learn more about your good work, where's the best place for them to go?
I guess my website, which is helenaclayton.co.uk.
Well, Helena, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Liz, for having me. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Likewise. All right, guys, that is all for this week. Until next time, bye-bye.
Hey guys, if you're getting anything out of this show, please head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. I read every single one, and honestly, your feedback is single-handedly what keeps this show going. So go to iTunes and let us know you're listening. Thank you so much for being a part of our community.